Welcome to Prescott A.V. Free's Sunday morning worship service.
Good morning and welcome to another Sunday of virtual church. I'm hoping at some point in the not too distant future we will be all together and meeting regularly. But even once we get there, I think having the messages posted on Sunday is actually something we will continue to do because our schedules can vary from time to time, and it's always nice to have that service as a backup so that if you're not able to be here on a Sunday, you'll be able to be with us virtually through the internet. As we normally do, let me just give you a couple heads up. If you do happen to drive by the church, I hope you notice the very initial stages of our playground project have begun. Jim and Harold have been working at moving the sheds that belong to the Boy Scouts. They're up in the gravel now behind the permanent basketball court. And that means now we're getting into the place where we can break some ground because we have to remove some of that macadam and put in, I believe it's some kind of a bark that serves as a protective measure for when the kids are playing in the playground. So the point is, we have begun. Can't give you a date when we will be finished because a lot of that is determined by weather and deliveries and that sort of thing, but at least we have begun. Also, in case you are not getting Jim's regular updates, he usually puts one out by email in the middle of the week, and then he puts one out on the weekend. And if you're not getting those, please call the church office and get on that list. We want people to be informed, and that's a challenge in these days. Some of you, obviously, if you're hearing me say this, you are comfortable with technology, you're on the internet, and we've been making bulletins, and we're still putting out prayer concerns and that sort of thing, and they're all online, but if you're not used to being on the internet or you're not getting that email, you may not know what's available. So if anyone here is not getting Jim's regular updates, let me encourage you to contact the church office, get on that list, and you'll be able to have the information and you'll be able to share it with others. Now, without any further ado, let's get into our study. As you know, last week we began a new series where we are working through the book of Judges. Judges being a span of about 350 years. It covers about 13 different judges, depending on how you count. And it really is one of the darker periods in Israel's history. And I suspect there are people that question the value of a study where the focus of the study is so negative. There's so much failure and there's so much defeat. And I get that, but the reality is I believe it is a very important and also a very practical study simply because our goal is going to be to understand, how did this happen? I mean, Judges should have been a time for progress. The foundation for success had been laid, but instead it is a record of failure. And so our goal is to understand how in the world did this happen so we don't repeat those fatal flaws that Israel had committed that led to this very dark period in Israel's history. We started last week in chapter 1 and uncovered the first fatal flaw, which was compromise. And compromise on its face can be a very, very effective way to deal with differences and resolve conflicts. But if you remember, we pointed out in non-moral areas. Because compromise is a very poor choice when it comes with dealing with God's truth. When we start compromising God's truth, it's very, very dangerous, as the rest of Israel's history demonstrates. They were called, as they entered into the land, to utterly destroy the Canaanites or utterly drive them out, and not to ever try to coexist with them. And they compromised that truth, allowing remnants of Canaanites to stay in the land, and that compromise cost them dearly. Now, I said this is a practical study, so I want to point out the obvious. We do not have the choice as followers of Jesus Christ to defeat those people or destroy those people or drive those people that are modern-day Canaanites from our world. Instead, we've been given a different mission. Jesus said, you are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. Paul challenged the Romans to not be conformed to this world. Instead, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. We are called to live incarnationally, transformationally, like Jesus, which is why we are called the body of Christ. And I would suggest to you that compromising God's truth today is every bit as dangerous and will have the same tragic consequences as compromising God's truth was for the judges. This morning, we're going to focus in on a second fatal flaw, which I'm going to describe as a decline in spiritual leadership within Israel. And again, this explains why the book of Judges is such a dark period of time, especially when you compare it to the success that preceded it, which was the result of the very strong spiritual leadership offered by Moses and Joshua. If you look back in history, God calls Moses and uses Moses to lead Israel out of Egypt. He uses Moses to navigate the wilderness, and then he raises up Joshua, who leads them into the promised land and lays the foundation for their success. But it did not take long for a new generation of leaders to rise up. And as they did, everything unraveled very, very quickly, and it shows how important leadership is. So this morning, as we consider this breakdown in leadership, what I hope to do is to be able to use that and evaluate the kind of influence that you and I have for the cause of Jesus Christ. So we're going to get started in Judges chapter 2. We'll begin in verse 6 and work down to verse 15. After Joshua had dismissed the Israelites, they went to take possession of the land, each to their own inheritance. The people served the Lord throughout the lifetime of Joshua and all the elders who outlived him and who had seen all the great things the Lord had done for Israel. Joshua, son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110. And they buried him in the land of his inheritance at Timnath-Heres in the hill country of Ephraim, north of Mount Gash. After that whole generation had been gathered to their ancestors, another generation grew up, who knew neither the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. Then the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord and served the Baals. They forsook the Lord, the God of their ancestors, who had brought them out of Egypt. They followed and worshiped various gods of the peoples around them, and they aroused the Lord's anger because they forsook him and served the Baal and the Asheroths. And in his anger against Israel, the Lord gave them in the hands of raiders who plundered them. He sold them into the hands of their enemies all around, whom they were no longer able to resist. And whenever the Lord went out to fight, whenever Israel went out to fight, The hand of the Lord was against them to defeat them, just as he had sworn to them, and they were in great distress. As we read this passage, what Joshua is doing is he's describing the breakdown in leadership in Israel. And to do this, he goes all the way back to the time of Joshua because he's trying to explain a breakdown. And so he's going to use Joshua's leadership as a baseline, as a starting point, so that when you compare this new generation of leaders to Joshua, you can see the decline. So let's look at how he describes the leadership of Joshua. And the first thing he points out is Joshua knew the Lord. And it's important that we understand this. The Hebrew idea of knowing in this context is probably a little bit different and a little bit deeper than what we would normally say. I can say, I know George Washington. And I do, on an intellectual level. I'm familiar with history, so I'm familiar with the story of George Washington. I've never met him. He's been dead for hundreds of years. So I could not use the Hebrew idea of knowing George Washington. I can speak, oh yeah, I know George Washington. But the Hebrew idea is much, much deeper. It speaks of intimacy. It speaks of closeness. It speaks of having a personal relationship where there's interaction and experience and the sharing of life together. For instance, very early in the book of Genesis, it says that Adam knew his wife. And the result of Adam knowing his wife is Eve became pregnant. She conceived a child. That shows you the depth of relationship and intimacy that is a part of the word know in the Hebrew culture. Joshua knew the Lord in a very intimate, very personal, very real way. It's the same kind of relationship that Moses had with God. It's called a face-to-face relationship. And Joshua enjoyed that same kind of relationship. In comparison, when we get to this new generation of leaders, what we're going to discover is that face-to-face relationship is lost. Secondly, because Joshua knew the Lord, because he had a personal relationship with the Lord, he regularly experienced God throughout his life. This probably began in Egypt. Joshua was there for the Exodus, meaning he saw the plagues. He was there at the Red Sea when God parted the sea and then collapsed the sea on Pharaoh's armies. He experienced God as they traveled and made their way to Mount Sinai when they received the law. And he was the only one that was allowed to go up onto Sinai with Moses and experience all that was happening there. He was with them as they navigated to the border of the Promised Land. He was sent in as one of the 12 spies. And he understood and rallied the people to enter the Promised Land immediately. He knew that was God's will. He was there when the people balked and were turned back into the wilderness so that faithless generation would die in the wilderness. And there in the wilderness, he learned the very hard lessons of disobedience. He later replaced Moses. And he had that same kind of face-to-face relationship with God that Moses had. He's the one who led the invasion and conquest of the Promised Land. And after they had achieved victory, he divided the territory up among the Israelites. And he had a firm grasp on why he had been successful and why Israel had been successful. And he understood the reason was God. And I believe we see that in his closing challenge to the people of Israel. And I want to go back to the book of Joshua, chapter 24. And this is kind of Joshua's last words to the people. I'm reading from chapter 24, verse 15. Joshua says, "If serving the Lord seems undesirable to you, then choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve. Whether it's the gods your forefathers served beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are now living. But as for me and my household, we are going to serve the Lord." And the people answered, "Far be it from us to forsake the Lord and to serve other gods." Now I'm dropping down to verse 25. "And on that day Joshua made a covenant for the people. And there at Shechem he drew up for them decrees and laws. And Joshua recorded these things in the book of the law of God. Then he took a large stone and he set it up there under the oak near the holy place of the Lord. See, he said to all the people, 'This stone will be a witness against us. It has heard all the words the Lord has said to us, and it will be a witness against you if you are untrue to your God.' And then Joshua sent the people away, each one to his own inheritance." And that's right where we are. Under Joshua's leadership, the people had entered the promised land, conquered the promised land. The land had been divided up, and now Joshua is sending them to possess their territory and do this mopping up exercise. And if we look at Joshua's leadership, because he knew the Lord, and because he had this experiential relationship where God was working in his life in a very visible, very tangible way, delivering victory through Joshua's leadership, he had made a very indelible, very positive impact on the people of Israel. They saw him as the one that God had used to give them their new home. They saw him as the one who had given them a future. Now, in contrast to Joshua, after Joshua passes away, after all the leaders who served with Joshua pass away, a new generation of leaders rises up. And look at how Samuel describes them. He starts with the fact that they did not know the Lord. Now, that doesn't mean they didn't know who he was. That doesn't mean they didn't have an understanding of who he was as God. What it means is they had no relationship with him. He had no role or place in their life. To them, God was the God of Joshua. God was the God of the elders, but he wasn't their God. They had no relationship with him. He had no place or role in their life. And as a result, they had never experienced God. And the reality is that only makes sense. If you don't have a relationship with someone, you probably don't have any experience with them in your life. I'll give you, for instance, the other day at our last elders meeting, when I walked in, a couple of the guys were talking about skydiving. And it didn't take me very long to figure out they were talking about skydiving. And they were going back and talking about the thrill and the adrenaline rush and all the ways that they had learned. And I have zero experience with skydiving. And I have no interest in skydiving. In Vince's world, jumping out of a perfectly good airplane in mid-fight is crazy. And they're talking about it's wonderful, it's thrilling, what an adrenaline rush. Man, I loved it and wish I could do it again. And let's just say that is not at all what I was thinking as I was listening to them. They had an experience with something, and they found it thrilling, and they found it wonderful. I had no experience and wasn't interested. And that's the way it was with these judges. They had no experience with God. And God was just, that's the person that Joshua and that generation of leaders followed, but I am not interested. He has no place in my life. And that meant that they were very, very spiritually vulnerable. They didn't know the Lord. They had never experienced him in his life. And as a result, they succumbed to the peer pressure of the Canaanites. And they began to embrace the culture and the belief system and the morals and the ethics of the Canaanites, just as the angel of the Lord had predicted they would. The angel of the Lord had said that the Canaanites and their belief system and culture are going to become a trap and a snare. And that's exactly what happened, and that had very real consequences. God was rejected, probably because he was deemed to be too strict and hard to please. And God was replaced with the Baals and the Asherah, and that's a kind of a male-female partnership within the Canaanite worship of fertility gods. And there were different Baals and different Asherah, but they all fell under this heading of fertility gods. And fertility gods were worshipped, sometimes with animal sacrifice, but often with male and female prostitution, and at times even human sacrifice. And the standards and the morality and the ethics of the Canaanite culture and practices were much more conducive to leading a self-centered, self-indulgent kind of life. And I suspect that's why this new generation of leaders began to slowly drift away from God and embrace the God of the Canaanites. And as I said, it comes with consequence because God responded to this drifting away with discipline. And he's very clear. He would no longer protect them from their enemies. Instead, he would allow their enemies to dominate and oppress them. And that explains the despair and the defeat and the distress that so defines the time of the judges. But it's also a perfect jumping off point for us to focus in on the development of leadership. And so let's pick up the narrative in verse 16. Then the Lord raised up judges who saved them out of the hands of these raiders. Yet they would not listen to their judges, but prostituted themselves to other gods and worshiped them. They quickly turned from the ways of their ancestors who had been obedient to the Lord's command. And whenever the Lord raised up a judge for them, he was with the judge and saved them out of the hands of their enemies as long as the judge lived. For the Lord relented because of their groaning under those who oppressed and afflicted them. But when the judge died, the people returned to ways even more corrupt than those of their ancestors, following other gods and serving and worshiping them. They refused to give up their evil practices and stubborn ways. Therefore, the Lord was very angry with Israel and said, because this nation has violated the covenant I ordained for them, or for their ancestors, and has not listened to me, I'll no longer drive out before them any of the nations Joshua left when he died. Instead, I will use those nations to test Israel and to see whether they will keep the way of the Lord and walk in it as their ancestors had. The Lord had allowed those nations to remain. He did not drive them out at once by giving them into the hands of Joshua. Now, last week as we started, we said one of the things we're going to see over and over again in the time of the judges is this very frustrating cycle of sin, suffering, supplication, and salvation. And as we start in verse 16, we're looking at that cycle at that point in time where God is raising up the judge to save his people. And that gives us a window into how very good, very solid, very godly leadership is established. The first ingredient, probably the most important ingredient, would be the Lord. And I say that because when I look at Scripture, I have no doubt that there is such a thing as the spiritual gift of leadership. And I believe God is at work, and he seeks to elevate those people with whom he has blessed and gifted with the gift of leadership. He seeks to elevate them and put them in positions of leadership. And I think that defines the various judges that we're going to consider throughout our study, just like I think it still is in practice today. The reality is we live in a broken world. And in that broken world, everything doesn't always work the way God has designed it to work. So that in our world, this broken world, there are individuals who seek out leadership, not because they're spiritually gifted, and not because God is elevating them, but because they crave power or control or wealth or recognition or status or any of the things that are normally associated with leadership. And the tools they use are things like self-promotion, blind ambition, and politics. But yet here in verse 16, what do we see? We see God elevating a leader and putting him in a position where God could use them to fulfill his purpose and his will. And I think there's a lesson there. Just speaking for myself. I tend to be very, very leery of those who promote themselves and seem to have a kind of a drivenness about seeking out leadership. I really do prefer the pattern that I see in a Moses and Joshua, if you look at it through that lens. Did Moses seek out leadership? No, not really. Unless you want to make the case that earlier in his life when he killed that Egyptian, that was actually a drivenness to lead. And I don't know that I go along with that fully. Maybe a little bit, but not a lot. God sought Moses out. Moses was out in the wilderness. And God appeared to him in a burning bush. Said, Moses, I've got a job for you to do. And if you remember Moses' response, it was filled with inferiority and excuse making and blame shifting and trying to avoid the call of God. He was the exact opposite of someone seeking out leadership. He was trying to avoid it. And then Moses was the one who sought out Joshua. And so I tend to prefer to see God at work in a potential leader's life, and in a way, I prefer to see God raising up that leader. That leads to our second thought. As God raises up a leader, or when God raises up a leader, he empowers that leader so that that leader can be effective in his new position and accomplish the tasks that God has placed before him. And that's exactly what we saw in the life of Moses. It's exactly what we saw in the life of Joshua. And that's exactly what we're going to see here in the Judges. And it's that fact that explains, in my mind, why the judge was successful, but also why people followed. People follow success. And so as God elevates a judge, and as the judge, under the empowerment of God, accomplishes the task and defeats the enemy and gives Israel freedom. The people see that, and the people admire that, and the people are willing to follow that, so that as long as the judge is in place, because he has that reputation, he has that credential of delivering for God's people, they're willing to follow. And I don't know about you, and when I bring this up, I'm not talking about like national leaders. We all have people that we admire on a national stage. And we've never met them. We've never had a conversation with them. We only know them through what they have done and how it has affected the history of the United States. So when I bring this up, I'm talking about people with whom we had a personal relationship, people that have impacted us, people that we would consider the heroes of our lives. And I don't know about you, I have a number of different heroes that I have met along the way. My father-in-law was a great hero in my life, very, very important to my spiritual development and who I am today. There's people that I've met through school, professors and mentors in that way, people I've met through my relationship with TNET, people that I've met, fellow pastors. I have people in my life that have deeply, deeply impacted me and in large part explain who I am today. And in every one of those people, here's the commonality. I could see that God had put them in that position and brought me into their sphere of influence where they were able to influence me. I could see that. And as they were in that position, their work, their ministry had the impact that I believe God intended, and that's how they became my heroes. And I suspect that you could see that same pattern in your life. And that leads to the third ingredient, I believe, in how the Lord works, because the Lord doesn't raise up these leaders, these judges, just because he has nothing better to do. He's raising up those leaders as a response to the very real needs of his people. So if we go back to our text in verse 15, it ends with the people are in distress. So in verse 16, what does God do? He raises up a deliverer who would save them. And when I look at that reality, and I raise the question, how are godly leaders developed? Don't ever minimize, don't ever forget the role that God has in that proposition. But he's not the only one that's described in this process. So let's turn from the Lord who raises up the judge, and let's look at the judges themselves. I've often said from this pulpit that God works by invitation only. And what that means is the judges had to accept and respond to God's call in their life. And the reality is sometimes God's call in our life is very hard to hear and very hard to accept. You may have a little bit of Moses in you and feel that you're inferior and unqualified and not up to the task at hand. So God, you better get somebody else because I'm not the guy. You got the wrong guy there. It may be because the mission seems impossible. We're going to meet some judges, and that's going to be their initial response. It's like, that is crazy talk. No way that's going to happen. And sometimes the mission seems impossible. Sometimes the mission may interrupt the plans that we have for our lives. And it's like, you know what, Lord? I'd really like to get involved, but I'm kind of busy. I'm over here doing my thing, and you're just going to interrupt me. And so in that case, it'd be very hard to hear God's call and accept it. And sometimes we're just afraid of failing. There may be 100 reasons why it's hard to hear and accept the call of God, but a judge has to hear, they have to accept, they have to seize the opportunity that God is placing before them. As I said, God's not just raising up these judges because he has nothing better to do at this time. He's raising them up in response to a need. His people were crying out to him. They were suffering. They were experiencing distress. They needed a deliverer. And God was raising up a judge to deliver them. And that judge would go to bat for Israel. And he'd confront the enemy that was oppressing the people and defeat that enemy. And then he would rule over them for a period of peace and prosperity. And a judge would have to hear that and accept that call and seize that opportunity and accept the challenge that came with it. Because the reality is, and we believe this, God can do anything. But when you look throughout history, most of the time, not all of the time, most of the time, God does what he does through people. People who are willing to answer his call, accept the challenge that he places before them, and in faith and obedience, follow him. But he can only do that as we respond positively. And unfortunately, that's where the reality of the judges is so very discouraging. Because when we look at the period of the judges, what we see is time and time again, God raising up a judge. The judge accepting the call, leading the people to victory, and then presiding over them for this period of peace and prosperity, just as God planned. And the stage is set for their success and a happily ever after life. But as soon as the judge dies, what happens? The people jump right back into sin, and it plays out over and over and over again. But what's interesting in the text is Samuel inserts an explanation that gives us insight into how God incorporated that into his will. And that's what I mean by providential testing. We believe that God is sovereign. We believe he's omniscient, meaning he knows everything. He's omnipotent, he's all-powerful, and he is faithful. And you add all those up and some other things that I didn't actually bring out, it becomes obvious that God was aware that all of this was going to unfold exactly as it unfolded. And he actually had a plan in place to address it. If we go back to where we started, this new generation of leaders, how were they described? They didn't know the Lord. They didn't know all the wonderful things he had done for Israel. They had no experience with him. So as Israel begins to compromise the truth and disobey, God decides to use that disobedience that he knew was going to occur, and that eventually did occur. He was going to use it to test them, is what the text says. And the idea of testing there is to prove them, and we would probably use this word, improve them, to make them better. When he tests them, he's not trying to harm them. He's trying to grow them. He's trying to make them better. They hadn't participated in the struggle to get out of Egypt, nor had they really participated in the fight to settle the promised land. They had never had to fight for their success. Their success had been handed to them. But as the leaders did not fully seize the success God was giving them by compromising truth, fatal flaw 1, and allowing some of these remaining people to coexist in the land. God said, okay, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to use those Canaanites to teach Israel some very important lessons. And I would say the lessons revolve around 2 things very important. Lesson 1, you need to learn to depend on me. Lesson 2, you need to learn how to fight. Let me just jump forward to chapter 3 and read the first 2 verses. These are the nations the Lord left to test all those Israelites who had not experienced any of the wars in Canaan. He did this only to teach warfare to the descendants of the Israelites who had not had previous battle experience. You say, well, why would God do that? Because God knew that Israel would have to fight for their lives for as long as they were in existence. Throughout its history, Israel has had a bullseye on their back because they are God's chosen people through whom he would work in the affairs of this world. And as a result, they have a bullseye on their back. And so he says, as they begin to disobey, I know what I'm going to do with this disobedience. I'm going to use it to make my people better. I'm going to use it so they can learn to depend on me, and I'm going to use it so they can learn how to fight, because they're going to need to know how to fight for the rest of their lives. Now, let me try to wrap this up for the day, because I do want this to be a practical study. And the reality is, probably most of us do not have an official leadership position. However, I would say we are all in some kind of position where we have the ability to influence people. And there's a difference between positional leadership, where you have a title and a position, and practical leadership, where you really don't have a title, where you really don't have a position, but nonetheless, you exert influence on others. Both of those things are leadership. It's just one doesn't have a title. Both are equally important. And so, because it doesn't matter whether you have a position or not, in some ways we all are in a position to influence others, meaning we all exert influence on a regular basis. I want to ask the question, what kind of leader are you? And because of the text that we've considered today, we've got a grid that we can use to answer that question from God's perspective. And so the first question I would raise is, do you know the Lord? Because when that is true, when you have a relationship with him, where there's interaction, where there's experience, where there's closeness and intimacy, the more that is true, the better the foundation in your life to influence others. Second question, is that relationship visible in your life? And here's what I'm getting at. As we walk with God, as we share life and do life together, we should be hearing his voice. We should be tuned in and sensitive to his leading. We should be following him so that he's at work in our lives. Do others see God's work in your life? Because if they do, that is really, really contagious. And it's really, really important. What good would salt be if it didn't have the distinct flavor of salt? So that if you're eating eggs in the morning, you say, oh, these need a little salt, and you put some salt on it, and then you took another bite, and nothing happened. There wasn't any difference. What good would that salt be? It'd be like Jesus said, it's worthless. Because salt lends a distinctive flavor. What good would a light be if it doesn't illuminate the room? So the room remains in darkness. And so the second question, do you know the Lord and have that relationship with him? And the second question is that visible? Can people see the Lord at work in your life? Can he see the difference he's making in your life? Because again, when that is true, your ability to influence others is enhanced. And then, third question, are you seizing the opportunities, accepting the challenges he places before you? And I ask that question because that's what leaders do. They accept that challenge. They seize the moments as God presents them. And that's why people follow. Because as we seize the moments, as we grab the opportunities God puts before us, he works within us to accomplish his will in those moments. And when people see that, it's like, wow, look at what God is doing through that guy's life. They follow. That's why I have certain heroes in my life, because I've seen God at work in their life, and God used them to make me who I am today. And that's the challenge I have for us. Because there's people that God has brought into our life that he wants us to influence positively. And that means we've got to seize the moments he presents before us. And seize those opportunities and accept those challenges so that he can work in us and through us and touch the people that are around us. Simple reality is God uses people to influence others. And so I end with this question. Will you allow him to use you? Will you let him raise you up to be a deliverer in someone else's life? Can we pray together? Father, thank you for this time that we've had together, even though it's through the internet. Father, it's been a good time. I appreciate the challenge that you have for us here today. Many of the people that are listening in, they don't have a position of leadership. But there's probably some moms or dads out there, and they're in a position to influence their children and their family. There's people that have neighbors out there, and they're in a position to influence their neighbors. There's people who have coworkers, and they're in a position to influence their coworkers. They have friends, they have extended family, and we're in position to influence them. We all have people in our lives that you've brought into our lives, and your plan is that you would use us to influence them. And you gave us a challenge here today. How is godly leadership developed? Starts with knowing the Lord. It starts or continues with experience you at work in our lives, so that as you work in our lives, we are able to impact the lives of those around us. So I really pray as we ask the question, what kind of leader am I? That we would take that seriously. And they'd really think, is my walk with the Lord of such a character that people know that I'm a follower of Jesus Christ, and they can see Christ at work in me. They can see the difference he's making in my life, so that work makes me better. And because I'm becoming better, I am contagious for the cause of Christ. Father, may we think seriously about this. May we accept that challenge to be better leaders, and may we grow more and more to be the kind of leaders you want us to be. I pray in Jesus' name. Amen.